In this video, we're going to meet every current Nintendo development team that we know is likely to be working on first-party Nintendo titles right now. From core groups in Nintendo's secretive Kyoto offices to partnerships across the world, from Austin to Australia and from Paris to Poland, we are going to look at the whole of the Nintendo game development operation, the teams that are likely to be working on Nintendo properties for the next generation of Nintendo games right now. In the course of this video, we will meet several dozen Nintendo development groups. Now, of course, Nintendo is always reaching out to new developers and partnering up with new people, and so this video will probably need updating as time goes by. Equally, I have set some limits. Nintendo has a huge number of support studios who work on games, including some such as 1UP, who are first-party support studios, as well as scores of studios who do general assist work. I may do a separate video on these, but my general approach is not to include these studios unless they have a very substantial portion of a game's credits, half or more, at which point they're practically becoming development partners. There are also subsidiaries of Nintendo which are really important, but which I won't consider right here. Nintendo Pictures handles a lot of animated sequences within games and is the subject of another video I'm working on, while Nintendo Systems, a new subsidiary which emerged out of Nintendo's partnership with Japanese mobile tech giants DNA, is also the focus of its own video, which I will link in the notes below. Before we begin, I must also give thanks to the channel's wonderful patron supporters who are helping me to be able to do more broad-reaching videos like this. The details of how you too can support the channel are in the show's notes, as well as links to the current version of the organisational chart you see on screen right now and that I'll be referring to as we go through the video. Without further ado then, settle in and let's meet the development teams of Nintendo. Now, our starting point has to be the Entertainment Planning and Development Group, which is really the nerve centre of every game Nintendo makes, and which is primarily, though as we'll see not exclusively, based in Kyoto. One way or another, just about every Nintendo game is handled by EPD, and leading the department are some majorly important senior figures. You will know Shinya Takahashi from his appearances in Nintendo Directs, but he has a long history with the company, including as a director on Wave Race 64, and is a senior executive officer as well as a company director. Effectively, since Satoru Iwata was both a game developer and a corporate leader, while his successors as president have not worn both caps, Takahashi-san is the leading developer at Nintendo, and his is an extremely important voice at the big N. Immediately below him is the senior executive officer with responsibility for, among other things, EPD and another fairly familiar face, Yoshiaki Koizumi, who has contributed to so many Nintendo games, from the script of Zelda Link's Awakening to directing Zelda Majora's Mask, and now running the Tokyo branch of EPD, which is responsible for 3D Mario. Of course, his most recent claim to fame was as the project manager for the original Nintendo Switch. Another senior figure is Takashi Tezuka, who has been shepherding Mario since helping to direct 1985 Super Mario Bros. Under Shigeru Miyamoto. Of course, there are many other deputy general managers at Nintendo, and many of these are names you will recognise, including Animal Crossing Supremo Katsuya Iguchi, Splatoon's very own Hisashi Nagami, and Wii Sports director Takayuki Shimamura. These gentlemen have very deep roots with Nintendo and have been responsible for many of their major franchises. However, while these people have overall responsibility, it appears that there are many discrete teams within Nintendo. Now, Nintendo is naturally a very secretive company, so it's difficult to establish exactly how fluid or how rigid their structures are. We know they had a fairly major reorganization in 2015, and we're only starting to see how the dust is settling, but clearly they have big ambitions to expand. In fact, their 10,000 square meter site they purchased in Kyoto for a new development center was scheduled to be ready in 2027, but that has been pushed back to 2028 so that they can expand it even more. Officially, therefore, they are divided into numbered production groups, but it's possible to identify multiple subgroups within them by studying the credits carefully. subgroups which may well spin off into being their own development wings if Nintendo continues to expand its reach at the current pace. Still, we will dig into the capacities of each section as we go, but let's first look at the overall structure. Entertainment planning and development groups comprise internal development teams and groups who, to a greater or lesser degree, work sometimes with external developers. As you will see, even Nintendo's satellite studios across the world, from Tokyo's ND Cube to Austin, Texas's Retro Studios and more, have link people back at the Heartland Nintendo Studios. It really is the central nervous system of their entire game development enterprise. EPD's Groups 1 and 2 are primarily tasked with supervising external studios. However, it's not entirely clear that they are separate any longer, and seemingly they now operate as a single hub coordinating external development. In light of this, let's stick a pin in the first two groups for now and start by looking at Group 3, which is the first internal development team and one of the most legendary groups of all. I'm talking, of course, of the Legend of Zelda team. It will surprise nobody that this team is under the control of Senior Officer Eiji Aonuma, and the primary group is the team handling the mainline 3D Zelda titles. Since Skyward Sword, these have been under the directorship of Hidemaru Fujibayashi, and I have a previous deep dive video explaining who Fujibayashi-san is. It used to be that there was an internal 2D development team, but over time most of the 2D team seems to have either left the company, moved laterally within the company, or been absorbed into the 3D Zelda group. Again, I have a video covering those specific moves. That's not to say there is no 2D Zelda team internally, or that Nintendo couldn't do an Avengers Assemble style call to gather people from other projects and bootstrap themselves a new 2D Zelda team in direst need. But I think it's safe to say that the primary 2D Zelda developers at the present time are external studio Grezzo. Grezzo is an RPG-focused company of just under 100 people, led by Final Fantasy veteran and Secret of Mana director Koichi Ishii, and they have been involved in supporting Eiji Aonuma's team ever since Ocarina of Time 3D, which released back in 2011. Another regular partner is Tantalus, an Australian company which has a long history in video games, from Sega Saturn's version of Wipeout to Switch titles such as Rime and Sonic Mania. However, as far as Nintendo are concerned, Tantalus is the team they turn to for ports. They started in 2016 on Twilight Princess HD, and much of the same team continued to work on 2021's Skyward Sword HD. A secondary porting team developed Luigi's Mansion 2 HD, but this appears to be a different group, meaning that potentially there are two Tantalus teams continuing to work on Nintendo products. Tantalus appears to be working in multiple locations, but the core team on these games is in Melbourne. If we assume that both the Zelda porting team and the Luigi's Mansion 2 HD team are going to remain in the orbit of Nintendo, this gives two potential groups who could be developing future Nintendo titles. Then, allied to EPD3 are Amiga Force, a division of Koei Tecmo responsible for the Dynasty Warriors games, but for Eiji Aonuma are better recognised as their partners on Hyrule Warriors and Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. Counting the Switch and 3DS versions of the original, there have been 4 Hyrule Warriors retail releases, and Amiga Force have also worked closely with Nintendo elsewhere, developing Fire Emblem Warriors, including Three Hopes. Finally, one Zelda team that may have finished their association with the brand is Brace Yourself Games, responsible for 2019 surprise rhythm hit Crypt of the Necrodancer, Cadence of Hyrule. An indie company based in Vancouver, Brace Yourself has continued to use Crypt of the Necrodancer's format to link to other franchises, with a Hatsune Miku crossover DLC recently being announced, but it has also fallen on hard times, with senior producer Crystal Savin suggesting 50% of the workforce was laid off during a 2023 round of job cuts, which appears to be about 20 people. Nintendo seems to quite enjoy plugging its classic franchises into odd formats, the 99 and Warriors titles being 2 examples of these, so while Cadence 2 or another bout of Nintendo Necrodancing are possible, it is perhaps a little unlikely at this point. Of course, time was Nintendo did have other Zelda collaborators, and none more prominent than the mighty Capcom, with whom they develop games from the Oracle titles through to the Minish Cap. Hidemaru Fujibashi started as a director for Capcom, but it has been a very long time since Capcom worked on a Nintendo first-party title. For now though, that wraps up EPD Production Group 3, and let's cross over therefore to Production Group 4, who are the crazy ones at the party. Responsible for games as diverse as 1-2-Switch and its sequel, Nintendo Labo and its spiritual spin-off Game Builder Garage, Ring Fit Adventure and more, anything on the casual, experimental and especially using the technology of the console and its controllers in surprising ways is probably going to have EPD4's signature on it. The team appears to be relatively small, but quite diverse, enough that we can seemingly identify 3 broad groups within it, though given their mission is to experiment and innovate, I would guess that these groups will continue to be extremely fluid. One is what I call the Party Group, the developers behind 1-2-Switch and its sequel Everybody 1-2-Switch, the latter with some assistance from Nintendo's regular party game in-house team, ND Cube. I don't know if the muted reception of Everybody 1-2-Switch has been enough to scare people off the property, but it would not surprise me if Nintendo continued to work on generic party titles outside of the Mario Party brand. Then there's the Fitness team, with many of the Ring Fit Adventure group working on Switch Sports, and some making a detour along the way for Jump Rope Challenge. Given what a success both Ring Fit and Switch Sports have been, I would bet on this group continuing to grow in importance at Nintendo. Finally, of the core teams, we have the Labo group, who then cannibalized their own game into Game Builder Garage in 2021. Now, as I say, take this with a pinch of salt, as I think these teams are a lot less discreet than others we will meet. Game Builder Garage's director Naoaki Masuda, for example, also pitched in with Switch Sports. But I think it's interesting that there are 3 discrete strands of games within EPD's core groups, and that these have had a roughly 3-year rolling release cycle. Now, while EPD4 is an internal studio, they do bring in outside help. Sometimes this is simply dragooning in other people from across Nintendo EPD to support. For example, many of the developers in Zelda Breath of the Wild helped put together the expansive world of Ring Fit Adventure, but they also have a few different external partners they work with. A secondary team at Grezzo, which seems responsible for porting titles, helped them with the port of Miitopia. It's particularly striking that they, and not the EPD group behind the original Miitopia game, led the development of this port, which does suggest that any future game in the Miitopia Tomodachi arc of games will probably also be under the aegis of EPD4 and possibly, as Grezzo continues to grow, utilising the secondary Grezzo team that gained experience on the franchise through adapting Miitopia. As we noted, EPD4 also collaborate with ND Cube, especially on titles like Everyone 1-2-Switch, taking advantage of ND Cube's special area of party mechanics, and the group have helped shepherd external projects as well. For example, they, not the core Mario Kart team, were the EPD points of contact with Velan as they developed Mario Kart Live Home Circuit. Still, for a Mario Kart branded product, the live game didn't seem to hang around very long, and given Velan's recent straitened conditions, having to lay off staff, I suspect that alliance is one of the less likely to be revisited. A particularly close partner, though, is Indie a team which has worked on multiple titles for Nintendo over the years, including most recently Nintendo World Championships NES Edition and its spiritual predecessors, the NES Remakes games, but also on Dr. Karishima's Brain Training for Nintendo Switch and Big Brain Academy Brain vs. Brain. Indie do other work, and with only around 50 employees in the Tokyo-based studio, it isn't incredibly large, but they do seem to be a reliable partner of Nintendo, and I think we can assume that the current cadence of a new game every 2 to 3 years from them will continue indefinitely. They also created with Nintendo the original IP Sushi Striker The Way of Sushido. Moving on across Nintendo then, we have EPD Production Group 5, and if you don't know their number, you certainly know their work, as they are the team behind both Splatoon and Animal Crossing. And when I say the team, I should direct you to a separate video where I examine in a little more depth to what extent the Animal Crossing and Splatoon teams have historically been intertwined, and how ready EPD5 may now be to work concurrently on both Juggernaut franchises. Check out the video for more in-depth look, but at the very least there are two separate skeleton crews within EPD5, one for each of the franchises, and there is good evidence to think that Nintendo may soon be able to claim two separate teams to avoid the need to alternate Splatoon and Animal Crossing development. Historically, EPD5 were responsible for the Wii series, including Wii Sports games, Wii Music and Nintendo Land, but it seems that these responsibilities have slid over to EPD4, and at this point it seems improbable that the group would split their attention from two such vast franchises that they have under their belts at this point. Perhaps because of the scale of both Animal Crossing and Splatoon, it won't surprise anyone to know that they brought in outside help with companies like Bandai Namco and Monolith Soft acting as support studios, but I'm not primarily covering support studio activity in this video. However, utility support partners ND Cube have offered their services a little, supporting in the development of Animal Crossing Pocket Camp for mobile and, of course, taking on entirely the development of Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival. However, with both Splatoon and Animal Crossing being ripe for franchise expansion using spin-offs and other initiatives, do not be surprised if more partner studios strike up a working relationship with EPD5 in the years ahead, and indeed it strikes me as a strong likelihood that this team will eventually split into two, so massive are both their major franchises to Nintendo's future. The next production group then is an unusual one. Historically, EPD Production Group 6 has shepherded external studios, but some of these studios are so close that they have literally become part of the Nintendo family. The group is embodied in its leader, Kensuke Tanabe, who has cultivated long-term working relationships with a number of Nintendo's closest studio contacts. Therefore, while EPD6 may be a relatively small operation on the Kyoto end, they deliver a number of major titles to Nintendo fans. First of all, just down the road from the Nintendo Kyoto offices is Intelligent Systems, a company which has at least two standing teams, including one that Kensuke Tanabe has partnered with for decades on the Paper Mario games. Between Paper Mario titles, they also work on the WarioWare titles. This is a very long-standing relationship, although his number 2 Risa Tabata has also remained involved with shepherding these titles. For a time, WarioWare was coordinated by Yoshio Sakamoto out of Group 9, but in recent years it seems that they have streamlined the operation so that Tanabe-san's Group 6 is responsible for everything that runs through this Intelligent Systems team. Another Japanese studio Tanabe-san has collaborated with in the past is Vanpool, but as this video on my channel explores, Vanpool sadly is no longer with us, and the Dylan Rolling Western series they collaborated on with Kensuke Tanabe appears to be on ice for the time being. However, Kensuke Tanabe is probably most famous for his collaboration with two of Nintendo's North American studios. He struck up a relationship with Next Level Games on Luigi's Mansion, starting with Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon on 3DS, released in 2013, and then Luigi's Mansion 3 on Switch in 2019. It's barely conceivable that he isn't collaborating with NLG even now on the fourth frightening entry in Luigi's premiere spin-off. His relationship with Vancouver-based studio NLG has been a strong one though, as he has also produced Mario Strikers Battle League and Metroid Prime Federation Force with them. I will go into Next Level Games in a separate video, but it appears that they have two broad development groups within the organisation, one primary group working on Luigi's Mansion and a secondary group working chiefly on multiplayer games and mechanics. While the relationship between these two appears to be incredibly porous, the recent expansion of the company following their acquisition by Nintendo could well move them to the position where they could have two standing development teams producing different titles. Travelling south from Vancouver though, and you get to another North American studio which Kensuke Tanabe has taken under his wing. In Austin, Texas, we find the home of Retro Studios, who have been working with the group that is now EPD6 for over 2 decades. To be clear, Retro is its own team at Nintendo and does not have to work with Kensuke Tanabe, and there has been decent speculation that they were working on a project not associated with Tanabe-san in the 9-year-long silent period between Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze releasing in 2014 and the release of Metroid Prime Remastered in 2023. Nevertheless, the reality is that while Retro were credited with support on Mario Kart 7, every game they have wholly developed has been under the supervision of Tanabe-san, and while it has often been said that Retro is a studio capable of having multiple development teams within the same grouping, it is not clear that multiple concurrent games have ever really made it to release from them. Therefore, while they are both the Metroid Prime studio and the Donkey Kong Country studio, it should be said that this is currently, as far as we can tell, an either-or arrangement. While they did port their own title in Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze to the Switch in 2018, Forever Entertainment have picked up the mantle for the port of Donkey Kong Country Returns, and now more than a decade has passed since any original Kong-themed collaboration has been confirmed, in public at least. It should be mentioned that Metroid Prime Remaster was not purely a Retro Studios affair, as it appears that Iron Galaxy Studios, also in Austin, had a decent hand in the port. Although it appears in this case they were still an assist studio, the company has produced independent properties before. The Austin team is their 4th branch across America. They also have teams in Chicago, Illinois, Orlando, Florida, and Nashville, Tennessee. While the likelihood has to be that Metroid Primes 2 and 3 receive more bare-bones Pikmin 1+2 style ports, setting up a whole studio in Austin is a fairly big move, and may indicate that they aspire to deepen relationships with Nintendo in the future, given that Austin is also the location of Retro Studios. With WarioWare, Paper Mario, Luigi's Mansion, Metroid Prime, and Donkey Kong Country in his turf, Kensuke Tanabe may seem to have a lot on his plate already, but it should be noted that before Nintendo reconfigured their development structure in 2015 to form the current Entertainment Planning and Development groups, the Tanabe team worked on a wider range of titles still, including producing Chibi Robo. Still, with the Chibi Robo team now kickstarting their own spiritual successor game, another collaboration on that front seems, I regret to say, a distant prospect. So, on we move to one of the smaller and definitely one of the most mysterious groups, EPD7, the group most closely associated with 2D Metroid and Famicom Detective Club veteran Yoshio Sakamoto. This group used to produce original titles. Indeed, until the 2015 reconfiguration, they were the group shepherding WarioWare, to say nothing of the Tomodachi Life series and similar games, plus Rhythm Heaven. However, since the Switch era, it appears that the internal development work from this studio has ceased, with EPD4 taking on the recent Miitopia port and EPD6 shouldering WarioWare. Nevertheless, there are 2 studios that remain in the orbit of EPD7. First, we have Mages, who were responsible for the 2021 remakes of the Famicom Detective Club duology, The Missing Heir and The Girl Who Stands Behind, and now 2024's Emio the Smiling Man. Certainly, Mages are able to handle multiple titles like these concurrently, and so they have the capacity to develop for Nintendo as long as Nintendo has the interest to keep bankrolling titles. Then there's the franchise that Sakamoto-san is most famously associated with, Metroid, and specifically its original 2D flavour. While he had partnered with multiple studios over the years, including Intelligent Systems on Super Metroid and Koei Tecmo's Team Ninja on Metroid Other M, in the last decade his Metroid collaborators have been Spain's Mercury Steam, who worked on Metroid Samus Returns and Metroid Dread, and who it's strongly rumoured are behind the next Metroid title. There has been a little disruption in that company recently, with Nordisk Film purchasing a 40% stake in the company in 2020, prior to the release of Metroid Dread, but certainly after the heavy lifting would have been completed on the title. And after the release of Metroid Dread, a string of stories about the company's poor treatment of its development staff slightly soured the press around the release. Nevertheless, Nintendo have managed these sorts of situations before. Interviews with developers on the original Metroid Prime have reported that they had huge crunch on that game, and Nintendo responded to fix things for Metroid Prime 2 and beyond. Mercury Steam is another example of a studio which seems to maintain just about 2 games at the same time, but clearly their Metroidvania team, and they truly are a Metroidvania team, having worked on both entries of Castlevania and Metroid, seems to be the larger team. It's possible that Sakamoto-san could yet again seek out other collaborators and perhaps even return to Tomodachi Life, but his non-involvement in the Miitopia port suggests otherwise, as does the fact that he seems very interested in developing games that stretch him as a storyteller. In 2017, a rumour was issued that the Rhythm Heaven team had more or less disbanded and no future Rhythm Heaven games would be forthcoming, at least in the medium term. Later that year, Eurogamer asked Yoshio Sakamoto to respond to these rumours of Rhythm Heaven's demise, and he replied, "We generally don't comment on those kinds of rumours, but I don't remember us ever saying it was over. Generally speaking, if there's an opportunity, a motivation, a need, we consider all opportunities and leave the door open. That's all I can say." Eurogamer pressed, "So you wouldn't say it was dead?" Yoshio Sakamoto came back with, "No, it's not dead." While it may not be dead though, it certainly seems to be having a very generous nap, and since Group 7 no longer seem to be putting out internally developed projects, as opposed to external collaborations with the likes of Mages and Mercury Steam, it seems likely that the franchise would require an interested external studio, or perhaps be moved over to EPD Group 4, where it might find a more natural home. As for Sakamoto-san, my hunch is that they have carved out a niche for him in the putative EPD 7, where they can let him focus on what he does best, and if the recent Famicom Detective Club and Metroid titles are anything to go by, that seems like a great move. Okay, so far we have travelled across America and Europe, but the points of contact at Nintendo have always been Kyoto-based. But that's not the case for our next production group. Production Group 8 is culturally very different from the rest for many reasons, and not least because it is primarily based not in Japan's ancestral capital of Kyoto, but its modern capital of Tokyo. In 2002, Nintendo was keen to tap into the huge pool of talent in Tokyo, and so a young group of developers, including Yoshiaki Koizumi, went over to set up the new team, primarily drawing from 3D Mario development staff, although their proximity to Tokyo's financial centre was a boon for Satoru Iwata, who regularly stopped by in the early days to see how the neophyte studio was getting along. They started with a small-scale project, the bongo-bashing GameCube platformer Jungle Beat, but soon were tasked by Shigeru Miyamoto to develop the next Super Mario title, Koizumi-san already having experience in developing for the overall overachiever in 2002's Super Mario Sunshine. Since then, the team has been responsible for every 3D Mario title, and in the early days, they even pitched into other projects such as NES Remake and Flipnote Studios 3D. Plus, they even had time to develop a spin-off in the form of Captain Toad Treasure Tracker. However, since Nintendo's 2015 restructuring, it seems that the team is in the same kind of situation as the Zelda core team, theoretically big enough to accommodate multiple concurrent projects, but realistically so involved with the massive task of producing the flagship 3D Mario titles that it could be unlikely that we'll see too many other types of games from them. They do receive regular support from Redmond, Washington, where Nintendo's lesser-known United States studio, Nintendo Software Technology, are based. NST worked on the Captain Toad Treasure Tracker and Super Mario 3D World Switch ports, and it's a fair bet that this working relationship means they will be tapped again in the future. The French Nintendo department Nerd also contributed to Super Mario 3D All-Stars, although it appears this was mostly in terms of the emulation engines for the N64, GameCube and Wii, rather than the games themselves, which were essentially untouched as playing experiences. It should also be noted that long-time EPD 8 veteran Yoshiaki Koizumi is moving onwards and upwards with the company, serving as the producer for the Nintendo Switch console and also on the board of directors for Nintendo Pictures, the new branch of Nintendo dedicated to film output and in-game cinematics, which I cover in a separate video. His close ties to both the technological departments and Nintendo's cinematic branch positions the team in Tokyo very well to take advantage of all the cutting-edge tech that you would expect for a flagship title like Mario. However, while Mario is the flagship, Nintendo's most valuable team surely has to be the group behind the juggernaut Mario Kart titles. Yes, EPD 9 is the Mario Kart group, but it's actually more than that. Historically, there has often been a lag of a few years between game releases, but then 2 EPD9 games come along at once. Most recently Mario Kart 8 Deluxe and ARMS in 2017, but before that Mario Kart 7 and Nintendogs and Cats were released in the same year as well. Of course, handling 2 smaller titles is a lot different from handling 2 full-fat entries on an HD, let alone a 4K system, but nevertheless Kosuke Ibuki is one of Nintendo's youngest developers by far, still in his 20s when he began work as director of Mario Kart 7, and perhaps for this reason he was able to corral the younger devs at Nintendo in the creation of the underrated Switch launch window fighting title, ARMS. Broadly, the 2 groups at Nintendo seem to be the old guard under Yasuyuki Oyagi and the new team under Kosuke Ibuki, but while we have had Mario Kart Tour and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe DLC over the last 7 years, there has been plenty of time now for both groups to potentially be developing new titles, something I explore a little more in depth in this video. Of course, while Ibuki and Oyagi are important figures, the last major set of credits for EPD8 games were 8 years ago, and so you can bet that the credits on the new generation of games for the new console will merit close scrutiny indeed. Then we have EPD10, a group which is in a similar position in that it balances one juggernaut franchise and one promising up-and-comer. In fact, one could argue that Pikmin has now fully arrived on the scene with a huge push in Japan, launching it across the 3 million sales mark within a year. The team has received extensive outside support for Pikmin, and in particular from Eighting, a Tokyo-based studio of over 200 people who led the development of Pikmin 3 Deluxe and supported extensively on Pikmin 4. My credits deep dive into the involvement of Eighting in Pikmin show that they were involved to quite a large degree, and it's far from impossible that they will take on an even greater role in future Pikmin titles, even though for now they remain only secondary developers. Still, what keeps the lights on at EPD10 isn't yellow Pikmin and bearded Amprats, but the Super Mario Bros. Franchise. Yes, good old 2D Mario, or for a long time the coolly received New Super Mario Bros. 2D Mario head honcho Takashi Tezuka has a deep history with the series, as the assistant on the original Famicom Super Mario Bros. And the director of the acclaimed Super Mario Bros. 3 and the less acclaimed The Lost Levels, but let's not talk about that. Since 2D Mario made its return in 2006, and including the Mario Maker games and Super Mario Bros. Wonder, EPD10 has been the beating pulse of the Mushroom Hunting Mavericks adventures. They even developed Super Mario Run for mobile. Historically, Pikmin games and Super Mario Bros. Games have largely alternated development schedules, but with the relative success of Pikmin in Japan and the undoubted success of 2D Mario, it remains to be seen whether this pattern will continue as Nintendo continues expanding. And certainly the fact that Pikmin 4 and Super Mario Bros. Wonder released in the same year augurs well for both series to be pushed at the same time. It would make a lot of sense for there to be an internal group working on the Super Mario Bros. End of things and Super Mario Maker, while a smaller team works with the heavy support of Eighting to keep Pikmin fans in the manner to which they would like to become accustomed. Okay, we have covered most of the internal teams responsible for Switch games, but there is still a way to go. Nintendo also has the enigmatic Production Group 11, or the Smart Device Production Group, under former Mario Kart mainstay Hideki Kono, whose remit is the mobile titles. Nintendo's mobile titles seem to be in a little bit of a fallow period right now, with Animal Crossing Pocket Camp shutting up shop, and only Pikmin Bloom announced in recent years, although of course Nintendo's partners at the Pokemon Company continue to take a more active stance in mobile phone development. But there are many more dev teams working with Nintendo to go. Under the aegis of the external production team that was formerly Groups 1 and 2, Nintendo has a whole range of development teams to coordinate. Let's meet them. First of all, they have some more first-party development studios, but whose work tends to be coordinated alongside the external teams. We've already met ND Cube, who have supported EPD4 with games such as, most recently, Everybody 1-2 Switch, but this is very much a side hustle for them. What keeps the lights on in their Tokyo offices is undoubtedly the Mario Party games, and they have a standing team dedicated to that. Nintendo also has a third-party ports team called Shiver Entertainment, which they took the unusual step for them of purchasing in May 2024. Quite what they will port remains to be seen, but this is not the only such partnership Nintendo can claim. They also have a deal with Forever Entertainment, which has so far resulted in the Donkey Kong Country Returns HD port in January 2025, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that other porting stalwart Tantalus, who as well as teaming up with Eiji Aonuma on the Zelda ports, also have that secondary team working on Luigi's Mansion 2 HD. Potentially then Nintendo could have 3 separate groups working on ports of games, although it's not necessarily the case that they will all be focused on first-party work. Nintendo's other first-party developer in America, Nintendo Software Technology, based in Redmond, have a decent history of games in their own right as well. I already mentioned their recent partnership with EPD8 on porting Captain Toad and Super Mario 3D World, but they also have taken the lead on games, including major titles like Wave Race and Metroid Prime Hunters, plus the infamous, but cancelled, Project Hammer, although more recently they've been focused more on the likes of the Mario vs Donkey Kong titles. They do seem primed to take a larger role among Nintendo developers going forward, but whether this is more as a support studio or whether they will take on more original titles remains to be seen. Another core group to the heart of Nintendo is Monolith Soft. Technically, Nintendo merely own 96% of the studio, but it's enough to make them utterly indispensable, particularly for Monolith Soft support in the Zelda series. But of course, their bread and butter are the Xenoblade Chronicles titles, and the studio has proven adept at putting out these titles and additional DLC on a rattlingly good basis, while talking about expanding into more original IP. The studio is clearly expanding, but then so are the demands on studios who wish to develop graphically intensive experiences on these ever more powerful machines. So exactly what the development capacity at Monolith Soft is perhaps remains to be seen. Okay, the next development group I covered in depth recently, Bandai Namco. They have a support studio, Studio S, but their major group dedicated now to Nintendo Works, Studio 2, have primarily served to support Masahiro Sakurai in developing the Super Smash Bros. Titles, but have kibitzed here and there on Mario Baseball and Kid Icarus Uprising, and all the evidence suggests that they will continue to do much the same going forward. Sakurai himself has his own production company, Sora, but this is just a company for him and his wife, rather than a standing development studio. Intelligent Systems is another familiar face, but as well as their Paper Mario team, they also have a group working on Fire Emblem. Indeed, it appears from the credits they may have as many as 2 different groups working at once on developing different titles. Now, as Intelligent Systems were making the jump to the Switch, the Fire Emblem group received a significant amount of help from Japanese publishing giant Koei Tecmo, who provided the bulk of the over 1,000 people working on Fire Emblem Three Houses. The core Intelligent Systems team, meanwhile, appeared to focus more on Fire Emblem Engage. Of the Koei Tecmo staff from Three Houses, about 80 people also then crossed over to work on the Warriors spin-off, Fire Emblem Three Hopes, although the bulk of that game was run by another Koei Tecmo branch, the Warriors-focused development group Amiga Force. All this makes tracking the Fire Emblem developers a little tricky, but I think we can assume there's at least one core Intelligent Systems team on Fire Emblem, plus a team which effectively co-develops with Koei Tecmo, probably under the technical direction of Koei's Satoshi Ubukata, who as far as I can see hasn't had a credit since 2019's Three Houses. Out of the Koei team, a subset also work with Amiga Force, but Amiga Force seems to be a very broad and diverse team who can juggle a whole bunch of Warriors titles, licensed and otherwise, all at once. My interpretation therefore would be that although Intelligent Systems has historically released Fire Emblem games in roughly 2-year cycles, there will probably continue to be 2 concurrent teams on longer dev cycles for the next system, although there is also the strong rumour of a group focusing on remakes as well. Lastly, it would scarcely count as a Nintendo Forecast video if I didn't mention Advance Wars. Historically, both this and Pushmo were developed by Intelligent Systems, but there does not appear to be a dedicated team within Intelligent Systems for either project at present. Nevertheless, the Californian team Way Forward did work on Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp, with some support from both Nintendo and Intelligent Systems, and so there is always the hope, the slim, desperate hope, that the Orange Star Nation hasn't been sucked into a black hole. Currently, the same WayForward director, James Montana, currently has another non-Advance Wars title releasing, and so while it's possible that he might realign with Nintendo in the future, it's clear that the Nintendo partnership did not roll right on, as has happened with other successful partnerships, like Mages on Famicom Detective Club and Mercury Steam on Metroid. Then again, since Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp was on ice for over a year after being finished, it's perhaps not a surprise that the team ended up drifting away from Nintendo's orbit in this time, even though I hoped they might be given a different project, Wario Land perhaps. Anyway, let's meet another studio close to Nintendo's heart, and the team that gave them the late great Satoru Iwata, HAL Laboratory. HAL is primarily known as a Kirby team, but they have had to make the jump up from smaller 3DS titles to mainline Kirby adventures. Moreover, a lot of the support teams they have historically relied on seem to now not be available. Kirby Fighters and Super Kirby Clash development partners Vanpool shut down, for one example. Still, the team seems capable of a few supporting releases alongside the mainline games, with Kirby's Dream Buffet in 2022 and 2023's Return to Dreamland Deluxe hitting the Switch. Although I have yet to fully deep dive HAL, it does seem that their team is rather fluid and not as segmented as Nintendo's groups sometimes are. A lot of people seem to share credits between Kirby and the Forgotten Land, Kirby's Dream Buffet, and Kirby Return to Dreamland Deluxe, despite the fact these titles released within 12 months of each other and must have had a heavy overlap of development time. It seems HAL is able to fluidly and concurrently work on multiple Kirby projects, and one erstwhile Kirby developer may now be free again, specifically the Kirby Epic Yarn devs Goodfeel, who more recently have taken the lead on Yoshi's Crafted World and Princess Peach Showtime. They also had an original game published by Spike Chunsoft called Bakaru, so the team are clearly now at a size where they can mount two concurrent titles at some scale, although whether they will continue to work with Nintendo or keep building their own original titles remains to be seen. Alpha Dream is another studio that bit the dust, but its developers have found other lodgings, and at this point it seems very likely that this is at ILCA. ILCA is a massive group with offices in Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, and Nintendo's backyard of Kyoto. We will meet them again when we talk Pokemon, but they have a close relationship with Bandai Namco and are likely to continue to be a reliable partner developer for Nintendo in the years ahead, and perhaps the new devs for the newly revived Mario and Luigi franchise. Then there is Camelot Software Planning, originally a Sega first-party studio creating the absolutely magnificent Shining Force titles. They split from Sega after their masterwork. The stunningly sensational Shining Force 3 was treated abysmally by Sega on the dying Saturn. They took to making the Golden Sun RPGs for Nintendo, and if you trade Golden for Shining, it's clear that these were new Shining games in all but name, but in recent decades they have been caught in the vortex of tennis and golf titles, mainly with a Mario-ish flavour. They are reliable partners, but whether the old magic can be sparked to life once again remains very much to be seen. Another independent-minded developer is the mighty Platinum Games. Nintendo does have a close relationship as the publishers of the more recent Bayonetta's, Astral Chain, and Wonderful 101, but of course there is a limit to how far Nintendo will work with them, as Nintendo opted not to support the Switch port of Wonderful 101, and Platinum still continued to develop games for other consoles. It would be wrong to count Platinum as a Nintendo studio necessarily, but nevertheless they do seem committed to producing a lot of games for Nintendo, with some closer collaborations such as on the exciting and original Astral Chain, and on the less exciting and original Star Fox Zero. Still, there are a lot of third-party developers who do peel away from Nintendo's orbit. Sin Sophia worked on the style-savvy games, but in recent years they have created an original game in the same broad genre and seem to have moved on from Nintendo. The same with Xenoblade Chronicles 3D devs Monster Games, based in Northfield, Minnesota, who have been focused on PlayStation and Xbox racing car games for a long time now. So too, it's likely, Ubisoft. Ubisoft was never exactly a Nintendo developer, they published their own titles, but their regular partnership with Nintendo produced the Mario plus Rabbids games. But the reported initial disappointment of Ubisoft with Sparks of Hope's performance and the recent exit of the game's genius creator Davide Soliani augurs poorly for more Ubisoft team-ups. Nintendo has worked before with Sega on F-Zero and Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, plus with Atlus on Tokyo Mirage Sessions. They also partnered with Capcom on Zelda back along, but those partnerships all seem of their time. While it is of course perfectly possible that these relationships could be rekindled, Ubisoft, Sega and Capcom are major studios, and there is a lot to be gained on all sides for a team-up with Nintendo, but none of them can necessarily be counted on at the current time to keep putting out games in support of Nintendo's efforts. Square Enix is also in this category, but there is one recent collaboration of note, the 2023 remake of Super Mario RPG. Still, this was developed by a reliable remake studio for Square Enix, Arte Piazza, and so it's not clear that this studio would have the capacity to transition over to becoming regular developers on a perhaps rebooted Super Mario RPG series, even if Square and Nintendo wanted such a thing to happen. It's an interesting possibility, but I think we have to count them off our list for now. One new collaborator in recent years is Arc System Works, who revived Another Code for January 2024's enchanting Another Code Recollection. Is this a one-off event or the start of an ongoing partnership in the style of Mercury Steam and Mages? There's no real evidence as to how well Another Code actually did, and this probably reflects the fact that it was fairly unsuccessful, certainly selling less than 1 million copies in its first couple of months on the market. But then again, it was a niche Nintendo product to begin with, and so may well have performed well enough relative to Nintendo's expectations to warrant revisiting. Let's hope so. Another Code does not benefit from having one of Nintendo's most senior and most beloved creators behind it, so there's probably a smaller chance we'll see it again compared to something like Famicom Detective Club, but if Nintendo were impressed by Arc System Works, it's not impossible that the relationship could lead to more games in the future. A team which has a longer connection with Nintendo is Arika, who worked on several of the Nintendo Switch Online Battle Royale games, Tetris 99, Super Mario Bros. 35, and Pac-Man 99. They also took the lead on previous Dr. Mario games, and most recently came ashore with 2024's Endless Ocean Luminous. Although they have done work for Sony, they seem heavily supported by their work with Nintendo, and there is no reason to think that this won't continue into the future. At this point, we have covered nearly every studio of note for Nintendo, but there is of course one glaring omission: Pokemon. Everything Pokemon is orchestrated at arm's length through the Pokemon Company, of which Nintendo is only a part owner. Nevertheless, in terms of game studios, there are a few regular partners. Firstly, there is obviously the Pokemon Company co-owners Game Freak, who seem capable of having 2 concurrent mainline Pokemon teams on the go at any one time. One team works on the generational title every 3 years, the other seems dedicated to massive-scale branch projects like Let's Go and the Legends games. The company also finds time to work on smaller side projects such as Pocket Card Jockey and Little Town Hero, so they have the capacity to work on other things, but these are often not published by Nintendo. Beyond that, Bandai Namco appeared to have a team working on Pokemon pretty much full-time over the last few years, with Pokken Tournament and new Pokemon Snap having been delivered both by Bandai. And Bandai Namco's close association with developer Ilka might have led to Ilka taking the lead, for good or ill, on the Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl remakes in 2021. It's possible that this collaboration ended after the muted reception to these titles, but all things considered, it seems unlikely, and I would expect Ilka to produce further Pokemon titles in the future. One fairly large company whose Pokemon-themed work may be a thing of the past, though, is Spike Chunsoft. A significant and diversified publisher in their own right, their last contribution to the world of Pokemon was the 2020 remake Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team Director's Cut. It's not at all clear that they are continuing their affiliation with Pokemon though, and while again, it seems likely that they will, only because trusted collaborators are to be valued, no further Pokemon Mystery Dungeon titles seem to be forthcoming. The Pokemon Company also hooked up with Chinese gaming giant Tencent for Pokemon Unite. Additionally, they have ties to another major international company, Niantic Inc., who developed Pokemon Go for mobile, and Select Button, with whom they developed Magikarp Jump and Pokemon Sleep. Then there's Nintendo's close partners and the other half of Nintendo Systems, DNA, who are heavily responsible for Pokemon Masters EX. DNA are generally focused more on the mobile and account systems rather than the games themselves, but in this case they do seem to have had some involvement with developing this mobile title. One crucial team with a deep history at Nintendo but a slow output rate in recent years is Creatures. Creatures were responsible for Detective Pikachu Returns and show no sign of improving their rather slow dev pace despite being co-owners of the Pokemon Company. They are working on the card game, but they seem mostly dedicated to graphical work connected with Pokemon. Naturally, as with Nintendo, the Pokemon Company is more than capable of continuing to find development partners, and perhaps we can expect this to happen. The Pokemon Company also owns another studio, Genius Sonority, previously of Pokemon Colosseum, but more recently of Pokemon Cafe Remix. They have been long-time supporters of the Pokemon Company's efforts, and although they have their own rather successful Denpa series, it seems unlikely that they will sever ties completely with Pikachu and pals. And with that, our tour of Nintendo Studios is finally brought to a close, except doubtless there will be more studios to come, and additionally I will put a link on screen to a playlist of all my deep dives so far, so you can learn a little bit more about each individual team. Plus, remember the organisational chart is available on the link below. Thank you to everyone who watched, thanks to my Patreon supporters especially, and I will see you soon for another Nintendo Forecast.